Okay, I'm going to get going so that we can do the introduction. And as people come in, they won't miss all the good stuff. I'm not the good stuff. The good stuff is our amazing panelists, Julia and Gordon, who I will introduce shortly. But in the meantime, for those of you who may not otherwise have a relationship with the R Street Institute or be aware of us, the R Street Institute is a leading think tank. We're focused on solving complex public policy challenges through free market and limited effective government. We focus on pragmatic, realistic solutions that foster American innovation, bolster competition, and safeguard individual liberty. I'm your moderator today, Nan Swift. I've been with the R Street Institute for nearly 4 years. I work for our governance project where I focus on important issues like the federal budget process reform, agriculture subsidies, and I also like to keep an eye on the Pentagon's budget, which is why we're here today. And we are joined by Julia Gledhill, who's with the Stimson Center. Julia is a research associate for the National Security Reform Program at the Stimson Center. She focuses her research and writing on Pentagon spending, military contracting, and acquisition. Julia co-hosts the Undiplomatic podcast and has appeared in various media outlets, including NPR, CNBC, and Vox. You can find her writing in The Hill, The National Interest, Breaking Defense, Responsible Statecraft, The Nation, and more. Basically, if you're online, you can find Julia's writing, and it's all very informative. We are also so honored and so pleased to have with us today Gordon Heddell. He is the former Inspector General for the U.S. Departments of Labor and Defense, former Assistant Director of the Secret Service, a former U.S. Army Chief Warrant Officer aviator. He has 4 adult children, and although he is retired now, he continues to participate in oversight events, television and print media interviews, and he's currently working on a book about inspectors general, which I am very excited to read when that is published, because inspectors general serve such a critical role when it comes to oversight and accountability of the federal government. And they have so much information, they need more information, and should have the support of taxpayers. They are our frontline taxpayer watchdogs. So today we are going to be discussing a really bad habit that some military contractors have of overcharging the Pentagon. Back in 2023, CBS had an amazing report on this critical issue, and it really raised awareness. I was getting emails from people who don't work on this issue, but know I do. People who aren't even in town, who are way outside the Beltway, saying, "Did you see this?" And I was like, I know, this is like Christmas to people who work on these issues and who always are so frustrated that they don't get the attention that they deserve, especially in our current very crowded media climate. So we were so excited. And then it felt like nothing happened. So we're going to talk about what is happening, how prevalent this issue is, how we can prevent it, what's changed, what hasn't changed, all those parts. So that's why we're here today. It's going to be part of a broader series where this big issue came up, but did anything happen? And at R Street, we focus on pragmatic solutions. So we say, someone should do something about that. And luckily, Julia and Gordon are exactly the people to do something about that. This is going to be a free-ranging conversation today. Again, if you have questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A tab and I will raise those. But to kick things off, I'm going to turn things over to Julia to give us a good overview of what has been happening, what CBS found, and where we see this problem. Julia?
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks to R Street for facilitating this conversation. I want to start off really high level talking about sort of the core issue behind military price gouging. And it is that the DoD does not have the information that it needs to negotiate fair prices on military contracts. So to put this into perspective, I want you to imagine for a moment that you are renovating your kitchen. This is obviously a daunting and very expensive undertaking. So you're probably going to shop around. You are going to ask for referrals from people in your life. You're going to speak to multiple contractors before you agree to a price for again, what is a major undertaking in your home. You might even go to Home Depot and investigate the cost of materials to see kind of what the damage will be for this type of project. The Pentagon obviously cannot do this. For starters, there are few contractors that can fulfill the Pentagon's needs. So right off the bat, the Pentagon is not in the best position to negotiate good prices on military contracts. The industry is very small. Further, the Pentagon relies on contractors to provide it with what is called cost and pricing information so that the Pentagon can ballpark what their profit margins might be, can understand if they're being ripped off. Now, obviously, contractors are not providing this cost and pricing information to the Pentagon out of the goodness of their hearts. That is why we have a statute called the Truthful Price and Cost Data Act, formerly known as the Truth in Negotiations Act, but still colloquially referred to as TINA. And Congress established this law to level the playing field, to give the Pentagon the tools that it needed to negotiate fair prices and reasonable prices on military contracts. The trouble is that TINA has taken quite a few hits in the past few decades. We have seen lawmakers carve out the law so that it's been essentially defanged to the point that TINA often doesn't apply to military contracts, meaning that these companies don't have to provide the Pentagon with certified cost and pricing data. Now, the certification piece is really important. That means that this cost and pricing information is accurate, complete, and current. Now, contractors can provide other types of data, historical pricing data. Contracting officers at the Pentagon can do market research. There are a few other ways that the Pentagon might go about assessing price reasonableness, but nothing is as good as certified cost and pricing data. And so that is really the central issue with military price gouging. Some of the biggest examples that we've seen of price gouging in the last several years have been legal. We have effectively legalized price gouging because of these carve-outs to TINA. So I'm happy to talk about what those carve-outs are, but for the sake of conversation, I will pause there for now.
Really briefly, one of the terms that I've seen come up again and again when I've been reading about this issue is the term sweeping. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So sweeping is a practice where contractors overwhelm the Pentagon with cost and pricing data in the period between the price agreement and contract award. So the negotiations are complete, but the money has not been awarded. The contract is not officially theirs. And so what happens is, in TINA, there isn't a specific timeline in which contractors are legally mandated to provide this certified cost and pricing data. And so what they do is they say, oh, it's so hard for us to find. Oh, they delay, they refuse, they provide all sorts of reasons not to provide this information. But they can sort of feign compliance with the law by providing it after price agreement and before contract award. Well, it isn't useful then because the Pentagon can't use it to negotiate the price. phrase. And so that's contract sweeping. And there have been some legislative efforts to address that issue, which I'm happy to talk about.
Right. We will get to the what has been going on legislatively, but also what hasn't been going on legislatively. But first, Gordon, especially as an inspector general, can you tell us what you saw of this issue while you served here?
Sure, Nan, I'll be happy to do that. Price gouging is not new. It's been around since the original 13 colonies. Military contractors have been overcharging the Pentagon for years at the expense of both taxpayers and the military, combating price gouging in the wake of, let's say, COVID-19. A good example, because a lot of price gouging occurs all the time, okay? And particularly now with the large defense industrial industries have merged into 5 or 6 companies that do most of the business. It's an ongoing problem for the Defense Department, and for that matter, for the entire government, but mostly the Defense Department, because we're talking about a significant amount of trillions of dollars and assets that come into play here. So the emergency periods are when we see a lot of this price gouging, whether it's in Katrina, which I had a lot to do with in terms of the oversight and addressing the issues and so on, tornadoes, hurricanes, the COVID-19. These are all times when we expect price gouging, which was bad before, to go up to even greater heights. At the start of the Korean War in 1950, Congress enacted the Department, the War Powers Act. This was around 1941-42, which had conferred President Roosevelt with sweeping authority to control the domestic economy during the Second World War. But look, just about every complex problem comes with its double-edged implications. And that's a problem with solving the price gouging issue, because it's difficult to find that perfect balance. Price gouging, as I say, is almost always there when we have national emergencies. So the reason for that is that during national emergencies, hoarding goes up. When hoarding goes up, prices go up because of supply. And emergencies also discourage businesses. This is the other side of that double-edged sword, is that businesses begin boosting supplies or discouraging boosting of supplies, because there's nothing in it for a lot of them if they're going to just charge the regular prices. But consequently, prices are capped, and there's very little incentive for a lot of businesses to increase supplies during these emergencies. And it's costly to find and transport extra products to these hazardous conditions. I was reading about one individual. It's a classic case, I believe, during Katrina, when he loads up his van with 20 generators, and he's going to double the price. He drives 600 miles or so to get to the emergency area. It was Katrina. And in his case, he was caught and prevented, and the generators were confiscated. But there's probably a lot of people would have paid that price. They needed those generators. So that's where this double-edged sword comes in. In his case, he even went to jail for a few days, but it gives you a sense of the complexity of trying to solve a problem that there's no perfect fix to. And so a lot of this comes down to something that's even, I hate to say bigger than price gouging, but it's the solution to a great extent. And that is achieving a financial audit stability within the Defense Department. It's been working on this for years. It has repeatedly failed to be able to address the need for good data. It's getting a lot closer. I feel more optimistic about it now than I ever did before. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit, but I want to explain the price or the issue of data and why it can be so important to preventing price gouging. The audit process, financial audit process, began in government in the early 1990s, and in 2004, the Department of Labor attained the first clean audit opinion in government. I know this because I was Inspector General at Labor at the time. But each year, hundreds of independent auditors examine the Pentagon's books to determine whether it can account for the money that's given and how effectively the military is spending it. Now, there's three possibilities for people that in the audience here that don't understand these audits, but you can get three grades, so to speak. There's an unqualified opinion, there's a qualified opinion, and then there's a disclaimer of opinion. A disclaimer is the same thing as saying that there's no way to do a satisfactory audit because the information you're giving is not relevant and not accurate in so many cases. But for a lot of years, pardon me, it's been a difficult ride for the Defense Department. An audit commission is just an example, commissioned by the Defense Department back around 2016-17, found that the Defense Logistics Agency could not account for $800 million in its expenditures. Now, I think it was a surprise to them as much as it was to the auditors, but imagine this commander now meeting with the Secretary of Defense and saying, sir, that $800 million that Congress gave us, we're not sure what happened to it. And that's exactly what happened. So for more than 10 years now, the DoD, Office of Inspector General, has been working with the Defense Logistics Agency and other DoD components to achieve fair and reasonable prices for non-competitive spare parts. Now, I use spare parts because it's just one relatively big example of where price gouging comes into play. I remember we were doing an audit of the Defense Logistics Agency, I believe it was. I could be off on the agency there, but what we found is that what we found that there were a number of helicopter parts that we needed, and some of these things we needed in emergency fashion. Some of them we could take more time with, but we needed these parts. And when we went back to the contractor, he had raised the price dramatically. In fact, we looked at 33 individual pieces of parts, and we found that in those 33, that the prices had been jacked up by 75%. Okay, and just for those 33 parts, it came to about $3 million overcharge, which doesn't sound, well, I guess in today's money, 3 million sometimes doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. And what happened here is that the way this thing, the contracting agreement was put together, it meant that over the next 6 years, we would be gouged another $17 million, okay? And so, but we paid this, but here's the clicker on that. What we found afterward is that we had all these parts already. They were stored away in a warehouse. We just totally lost track of it, didn't know we had them. We paid reasonable prices for them in the beginning, but now we're paying to buy new ones when we don't need them. It's just an example of where price gouging, but all this still goes back to data. It's knowing what you got, where it's at, is it functional, can it be used? And that's the problem. And so anyway, well, that gives you a little bit of sense of where some of the problems are. But don't forget this, data reliability is a big factor in price gouging.
Thanks. Oh my word, I'm so upset. That was really awful to hear.
Thank you.
Just that the parts were there the whole time.
Mhm.
Um, but both Julia and Gordon, can you tell us about other examples? We had one just hit the news last week, but there's been a whole bunch in recent years.
Well,
Sure.
oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Gordon.
Julia. No, you're fine, please.
Well, Gordon touched on the helicopter spare parts issue, which I just like to highlight is something that the DoDIG has revealed, investigated since the late 90s. Some of the earlier examples of spare parts price gouging, at least in the 90s, 2000s timeframe, was Hamilton Sunstrand. Boeing was exposed on a number of occasions, 2011, 2013. And, you know, as he mentioned, this can be a matter of a few $1,000,000. In the case of Boeing in 2011, 2013, it's like 10, $13 million. Lockheed has been exposed for, you know, price gouging on spare parts. And this, in the grand scheme of things, does seem like small beans in comparison to, you know, a near $1 trillion Pentagon base budget today. But I think what's so striking about this issue is that it's been going on for so long, and that we actually don't understand the true scope of the issue. And the reason for that is because it is legalized in many instances because of these carve-outs to contracting regulation and law. So TransDigm was another example of a sole source spare parts supplier that was exposed by the DoDIG for price gouging the Pentagon back in 2019. But even before then, there were two different occasions that the company was exposed for price gouging, you know, to the tune of like 4,000% over the fair and reasonable price on a spare part. And what's wild about that case as well is that, you know, on each occasion, TransDigm generated $16 million in excess profits, and then the second time, nearly $21 million in excess profits. Something that I think we often miss in talking about this issue is also that, you know, TINA does have provisions about mandatory refunds for defective pricing and when you gouge and the government catches you. But much like the requirements for certified cost and pricing data, mandatory refunds, you know, don't always apply because, again, the bill has been gutted, which is so frustrating because, you know, the House Oversight Committee had all of these hearings about TransDigm. There was a lot of hullabaloo about it. And TransDigm didn't break any laws. And they weren't legally required to refund the government. They got so much bad PR that they eventually decided to refund them for part of those excess profits, but not the whole on those, like, again, those two distinct instances of price gouging, which is super frustrating. And I'd like to talk about Raytheon for a second since you mentioned it, Nan. So the DOJ published their settlement agreement recently, so you can go read this for yourself. But what's wild about that case is, for those who don't know, Raytheon is paying near $1 billion to the government for defective pricing via the False Claims Act and a few other things. They bribed foreign, they did bribery, they did all sorts of things. But in the settlement agreement from the Department of Justice, it really lays out like how Raytheon violated TINA. And they had a number of contracts. It's like 18 different contracts doing a bunch of different things for the government. But basically what they did is they certified to the government, hey, our labor cost, our labor materials costs are accurate, timely, and complete. And, you know, here you go, like, give us the contract award, what have you. And later it was discovered that Raytheon had knowingly certified information to be accurate, complete, and current when in fact it was not all of those things. I'll pull up the actual agreement because they write, the Justice Department's writes that Raytheon had knowledge or acted with deliberate ignorance or reckless disregard of this fact that their true costs were lower than what the contractor proposed to the government. What's also, I think, relevant about this case is that these were firm fixed price contracts, which are exactly what they sound like. The price is pretty set in stone. And what's interesting is we've seen a few cases of contractors, you know, fudging a firm fixed price contract in order to lock in those excess profits. So, you know, for example, if your costs, your labor costs are lower than you expected, as was the case with Raytheon, they knew that it was going to be cheaper than what they were telling the government. With a firm fixed price contract, you just get to lock all of that money in. Whereas if your costs exceed the negotiated price for that contract, then the contractor theoretically is legally supposed to assume those externalities, assume that risk of, you know, having to pay more than they, you know, thought that they would have to for whatever it is. But, you know, there's a few cases that the KC-46, the B-21 program, where other contractors are also going back to the government and saying, oh, inflation, supply chain issues, like we need price adjustments to our firm fixed price contracts. And it's like, that is not what a firm fixed price contract is. So I will pause there.
You know, that's a really good point that you bring up on Raytheon, because it's so unusual what the government's response to this. You know, I mean, look, I've done a lot of work over the years with Boeing, for instance. I mean, looking at what they're, you know, oversight. And it's been one case of price gouging after the other, but very little has been done. It comes to a slap on the wrist, to be honest with you, you know, and we call it too big to fail. Well, we can't afford to have companies that are so big that we can't do something. And so this Raytheon thing, which Julia points out, I think it's a really great first step. And in a funny kind of way, it may have more influence on preventing price gouging than almost anything Congress will do in terms of closing the loopholes, you know, for sole source acquisitions, et cetera. So it's a really good one. We just have to wait and see now whether or not it creates change in all the other industries, of the other 4 or 5 industries. So I'm glad you mentioned that one, Julia, and you did a nice job of laying that one out. Thank you. Hey, Nan.
Yeah,
Oh, there you go.
There we
think
go.
I lost you for a minute. I'm sorry.
So Gordon, when you suspect price gouging, or, you know, just how do you identify it? Are there any
Well,
red flags?
there's a way. Yes, the first thing is price gouging. I hate to keep going back to data, but you see, we have no historical and reliable tracking on what's happened over the last 10 or 20 years, because we don't do a good job of maintaining our data. Half of it, if not more than that, is not relevant, or it's not accurate. So your problem in the very beginning is that you don't have any records. You don't have any way of going back and say to Raytheon, wait a minute, you know, we've been buying this thing for this long and this long and this long, and checking with the other industries. What are they paying for similar things? We need to have an argument when a company like Raytheon comes in with these exorbitant costs. So that's the first thing, and that's why I hit real hard on this idea of data and on getting a clean audit opinion. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's talk about it. I think, Nan, you were going to talk about what's happening now to address this. And I'm kind of leading into that, if you don't mind. But did you know that last year, the Department of Defense was unable to, this was in its 2023 annual audit, where, by the way, they did not do well. But last year, the Department of Defense was unable to account for half of its assets. Now, what does that mean? That would be 1/2 of $3.8 trillion in military assets and $4 trillion in liabilities. So data reliability is at the core of a great many concerns here. Acquiring that essential information, which we call data, And the absence of needed guidance, that's another thing. We're not telling people, this is the Defense Department is not doing a good job of telling people where to go to get this data, not telling them how to determine false data from good data. They need guidance, and that's not being provided. It's a big part of this problem. So without accurate historical data, it's impossible to build a long-term case against any of the big 5 defense industries. Now, I know Julia will probably do this better than I can, but I will say that Congress is doing some things. You know, you got people like Senators Warren, and I know she's doing a lot. Senator Braun from Indiana and Grassley from Iowa. They've teamed up with Representatives Garamendi and Deluzio to introduce legislation that'll address the legal loopholes that enable military price gouging. And Representative Doggett's doing some things. But unfortunately, what I read in the proposed legislation, I don't think is totally going to do it. Unchallenged market power and sole source contracting they're in a good position to get away with it. Even when we find it, we just don't know unless we're willing to do a Raytheon every other time. It's going to continue. And now it's a difficult thing. But what the states and the federal government are trying to do is to say that it's unlawful for people to sell or to offer for sale goods or services that are unconsciously excessive prices during, and let's say what they call market shock. You know, when something happens in the markets or dramatic, everybody's, people go out and spend money in emergencies they wouldn't spend otherwise. So it's easy to get away with it if you're doing the gouging. But anyway, it's just a few of my thoughts on that.
That's a really good point. So we have a good question submitted by an audience member that also gets to a question I wanted to ask. So I'm going to combine these for both of you. So I wanted to ask, I mean, you both were citing great examples of this problem, but, a handful of names kept coming up over and over. And it's like, well, why do we keep working with cheaters? If I didn't like someone and they cheated me, I wouldn't work with them again, or I wouldn't go back there. So to what Scott has said, and you'll see why I think these are related. He asks, do you get the sense that DoD created this problem for itself by subsidizing a small number of companies in the industry, thus downsizing the industry and incentivizing the remaining companies to focus only on government contract work and abandoning private industry products, causing them to become reliant on revenue from government contracts?
Well, if you're directing that question to me, I don't want to jump in on Julia's time.
For everyone.
That happened back, as you know, all of you know, that happened. It was the Cold War dividend. When we won the Cold War in the early 1990s, we knew that we thought that we were going to spend less money on defense products and needs. And so consequently, what happened was we had these defense industries, we brought them in, we said, look, just a warning, your profits are probably going to go down because we're not going to spend as much. So you might want to think about consolidating. They did that. They brought it down to 5 big companies. And what we didn't know at the time, we thought we were helping ourselves. We thought it would be simpler even. It was a monster in disguise, because what the 5 companies said, hey, we've got more power now than we ever had. We don't have to worry about marketing as much as we used to, because we got 5 of us. We can kind of work together. And under the table, I'm not suggesting that they're doing price gouging as a group, but when you look at it, they're all doing it. And I think if one gets away with it, they might say, hey, I think we can do this too. Let's add a little to the price on this thing. So unfortunately, we are dealing with a mess, and we haven't been able to fix it. And again, goes back, Raytheon may be our best shot. But I'm not sure if I totally answered your question, but I think that was that part of it.
I'll jump in to say that the Pentagon has actually supported efforts to narrow the commercial item definition. This is actually one of the carve-outs, one of the loopholes in TINA that allows contractors to avoid giving the Pentagon certified cost and pricing information. If a product is considered commercial, heavy quotation on that, then it is theoretically price competitive, and the Pentagon maybe doesn't need to do as much due diligence to ensure that it's a fair, reasonable price. What's happened is contractors have lobbied Congress to expand this commercial item definition such that it means essentially nothing. It doesn't require that a commercial product has ever been sold to the public, much less is currently sold to the public. So the Pentagon does not benefit from that. The Pentagon is actively dealing with this issue and has in the past supported efforts, again, to narrow the commercial item definition. I'll also say, there are like 40,000 contracting officers-ish at the Pentagon, and I won't often talk about the DoD being under-resourced. I do, however, think that it probably does need sort of a bigger contracting workforce. I think that there need to be more COs. I think that they have a pretty difficult job given the tools that they are provided. Now, I obviously think that DoD has played a role in subsidizing industry. It is too small. The peace dividend led not only to the consolidation of the industry, but also a parallel acquisition reform movement that was actually designed to protect profits, even as the defense industry decreased from 50 plus contractors to basically 5. That has incredibly detrimental effects to the taxpayer and to the military. And it's interesting actually to think about the political environments in which that happened versus the political environment in which TINA was established. Congress passed TINA in 1961 or 1962. A year after Eisenhower gave his really famous speech on, the importance of the United States avoiding the excesses of the military-industrial complex. This was after a decade of, military analysts and civil society and the DoD really struggling with sort of how to compete with the Soviet Union and how to win the Cold War. This was also a time when, Robert McNamara established the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system, which is our whole budget and acquisition system that the DoD uses to this day, and is undergoing reform efforts, which is a whole nother conversation. But that was a time when the United States was really focused on efficiency and winning the Cold War. Whereas in the 90s, there was kind of this sense, okay, we're on top, let's make people a bunch of money, even though we don't super need, these products anymore, hence the parallel consolidation process. So I don't mean to absolve the Pentagon at all from responsibility in subsidizing industry and sort of enabling price gouging. But they do not benefit from this system. It is lawmakers who have been influenced by industry through campaign donations and a number of other things to carve out TINA such that the Pentagon doesn't have the tools it needs to negotiate these deals, which doesn't make their job any easier.
Can I add to that, Julia? I thought that was really helpful. I found that interesting. I think one of the problems here, and the controller and chief financial officer under Secretary Michael McCord makes a good point here. And I think he's right on. It's something I've thought about a long time. And that he calls it a cultural, he says we need a cultural change. I agree with him. I just simply call it an attitudinal change at the Department of Defense. And what I mean by that is that you have these people like the chief financial officer, McCord, and all of his people who do the acquisitions, et cetera, at headquarters, at the Pentagon. I'm sorry. What they have failed to do is make the connection between human involvement, the people that are out in the world, military officers, non-commissioned, commissioned, who are supposed to provide the data. And they don't know how to provide the data because they've never been given, many of them have not been given the guidance, but it's more than that. They don't have a reason to do this because their focus is on the mission, the combat, the wars, the keeping America safe. Okay, that's their, and I remember when I was in Secret Service, and there were times, I just said, hey, we're trying to protect President of the United States here. I'm going to ask for whatever I can get to help me do that job. And I wasn't really concerned about the cost. Now, I know now that was not the right attitude. And by the same token, I really wasn't following up sometimes, and many don't, to tell headquarters, hey, this is a problem. Because again, my focus was on keeping the president safe and on preventing some individual or group from taking the life of the president, and at the same time, taking the votes away from 160 million people. And so this connection has to be made. People out there doing the work, providing the data, interpreting the data, have to understand why they're doing it. Well, the reason they're doing it isn't to get a clean audit opinion. That's just the means to do it. The reason they're doing it is so that we can have more effective combat and success in our defense missions. That's the whole point of doing any of this. But they see that's where the disconnect is. The people doing the work, the people providing the data don't understand that all the time. And so that's where McCord, Undersecretary McCord, is trying to bring that together. And I think it's a smart move if he can only do it.
That's so important. I wish we could stop there because that's like the perfect last word, but we have other things to discuss before we close out. And just a reminder to other folks participating in our event today, if you have questions, we have answers, and you can put those in the Q&A tab. We would be happy to consider them. So Gordon touched a bit on what some lawmakers, notably a bipartisan cadre of lawmakers, is trying to do on this. And some, like Senator Grassley, have been trying to look under the hood at the Pentagon for a very long time. But Julia, can you tell us more about what's happening legislatively?
I would be happy to, Nan. So as Gordon mentioned, Warren, Braun, Garamendi have this bill, Stop Price Gouging the Military Act. It is very ambitious, y'all. It does a lot of things, one of which is to narrow the commercial item definition, which I mentioned, so that commercial items are in fact commercial and not just fake commercial where they're not sold to the public at all and there is no presumption of price competitiveness. But there have also been a number of piecemeal efforts throughout the NDAA in the last few years to improve DoD's ability to negotiate fair prices on military contracts by, again, requiring this certified cost and pricing information. and just better understanding the scope of the issue. Now, the trouble with these provisions is that they are so hard to get through the rules committee, much less the committee review process, conferencing. So they've kind of all landed, or died, I should say, in different parts of the NDAA legislative process. But I want to talk about a couple from Deluzio, as well as Representative Doggett. So we talked about sweeping a little bit a few minutes ago, which is again when contractors kind of wait till they've negotiated their price and then overwhelm the Pentagon with all of this information that is no longer useful to them, to sort of feign compliance with the law. And so Representative Deluzio and Moylan introduced a bill called the Best Price for Our Military Act, and it would essentially require contractors to provide that certified cost and pricing data before price agreement and not just before contract award, which again, like that period of time can be quite fraught for the Pentagon and for contractors because of the sweeping issue. And so this bill basically says, yo, you have to give us this information while it's still relevant, when we're still negotiating the price of the contract. And that has made it into the House version of the bill. So cross your fingers, it makes it through conferencing. I can't say I'm super optimistic, but we all have to be in this line of work to some extent. So the other provision that I'd like to highlight is from Representative Doggett from Texas, which is really just an info-seeking provision to better understand the scope of potential price gouging for sole source contracts. So as you can imagine, with these loopholes in TINA, where contractors are not required to give this cost and pricing information, the impacts are huge when considered collectively over time, even if each individual instance of price gouging is a few $1 million here, drop in the bucket when you're talking about the Pentagon budget. But sole source contracts, I mean, if you have one supplier providing a product to the Pentagon, and they don't have to do anything to demonstrate the price reasonableness that they are, offering to the Pentagon, that's pretty ridiculous. The Pentagon itself has said that they expect this issue to be much more prevalent than they currently understand. They just don't have the data. And so Representative Doggett has a provision to basically just establish a review panel to look at sole source contracts, in the last 15, at least in the last 15 years, and compare negotiated contract prices with the actual cost outcomes. So again, you can see instances like Raytheon where their labor costs were a lot smaller than they actually told the government, which is a false claim, which is part of the reason why they're paying this, near $1 billion payout to the government. But basically to look at those discrepancies and see, better understand the true scope of price gouging in the context of sole source contractors. I would also note, TransDigm, the example that we discussed earlier, was a sole source spare parts supplier. And, they were able to get away with price gouging legally because they basically divvied up all of their contracts so that none of them met the mandatory disclosure threshold for providing certified cost and pricing data. 95% of their contracts in like the relevant period of time for which they were investigated and later revealed by the DODIG for price gouging, 95% of those contracts were below this $2 million threshold. So, Barbara Lee, Deluzio, Garamendi, like representatives have, made several efforts to address this mandatory disclosure threshold issue as well as the commercial item definition, but it hasn't gone anywhere. It hasn't made it into law, I should say. But, there's no small wins in this line of work. It all matters. So, yeah, these are all just like a part of the puzzle of sort of giving DoD the bargaining power that it needs to best serve the interests of the taxpayer and the military.
I would add to this. I think one of the concerns I have is that some of the solutions shouldn't be as difficult as they are. It is a complex problem. There's no question about that. But now we've only got 5 industries, 5 companies to really deal with. And I sometimes think that there's no inward look, there's no circumspect, there's no scrutiny of ourselves. In other words, the Defense Department will blame Congress. They may blame, people are always looking to see if somebody else caused my problem. Congress does the same thing. They're looking at the Defense Department saying, look what you guys are doing. And I'm not saying there's not truth to the scrutiny that's going on and what they find, but I believe that with only five companies, they need to sit down with these companies. They need to come up with some kind of a summit. And we sit down with these five companies. We tell them, and it has to be a very carefully selected group of people from the Hill and from the Defense Department and from the industries. We sit down, we say, look, any more price gouging this is what it's going to cost you. It'll be an automatic. You saw what happened to Raytheon. Be an automatic disciplinary outcome, and it's going to cost you a lot of money. But it's not, and just find a way to make it automatic. It just should not be this difficult. Now, part of the problem is that the Defense Department, the acquisition experts, and so on, they're busy, they're overwhelmed, they don't have accurate data, and you would think that they would be able to say, no, I'm not paying that, it's too much. But the politics of acquisition and the timeliness, particularly during war when these items are needed, it creates urgency that we shouldn't have to be dealing with all the time. But we're constantly in a state of crisis, constantly in a state of urgency. So we got to sit down, I think, once and for all and say that we're not doing this anymore. We're just not. And I hope that somehow, I'm not saying there's not communication, but I don't think it's aimed at an ultimate solution. It's aimed at getting us out of the current crisis we're in. And let's face it, if you're in an emergency, you need it, you'll pay any price.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point. And there are a couple things that I think that we can look toward as, ambitious, aspirational legislative actions to prevent this issue. And one of them is just like consequences, like non-compliance penalties after, 3, 4, 5 times that you are revealed for ripping off the government and the taxpayer. Like, you don't get to receive government contracts anymore. Now, that you can't do that alone. You would have to do other things to stoke competition so that you actually have contractors who can, again, fulfill the military's needs. But I think that that's a huge one. And also just like on the data denials and delays, short of providing, inaccurate, incomplete, or untimely information that you wrongfully and falsely certify as all of those things, as Raytheon did. Contractors, as I mentioned, will often delay the provision of this information until after price agreement before contract award. Again, that's contract sweeping. Or they will refuse to do it. They'll do all these things. And the DoD doesn't track that. I think it'd be really helpful to understand how much that happens and, what impact do those delays or refusals have on the timeline in which the DoD reaches price agreement and or, provides a contract award because of this question of urgency, which Gordon touches on, which is that like there are going to be times where the Pentagon's like, we need this now, and we're just not going to wait around for you to comply with the law. And so they're going to move forward, and we don't know. It's definitely something that potentially happens, but we just don't understand the true scope of that issue. That's something that the GAO has pointed out. And I'll also note that, a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, after the CBS investigation came out, shortly thereafter, Bloomberg published a relevant piece on Boeing, refusing to provide the government with this cost and pricing data. Boeing and TransDigm, I think together, basically accounted for all of the data denials to the Defense Logistics Agency, like in that year, in like 2022, I want to say. And so it's like, yeah, we have companies that have been doing this for literal decades, and they still generate the majority of the revenues from government contracts.
Well, okay, we are running up against the clock here, and I want to get to a couple questions that people have submitted really quickly. First, Shauna, I want to address your excellent question about the role that whistleblowers play. And it's such a big deal that we're going to do a standalone event on whistleblowers because we don't have time to get into it here, but it's significant and it's important. And sometimes that's how things are brought to light, especially in the absence, as Gordon has illustrated, of really good data. I also want to make the point very quickly that, I mean, I think what gets to the core of my frustration with the apparent inaction post CBS, and while yes, there's a handful of lawmakers who are doing these bills, and that's great, but that's a very small constituency within the broader Congress. And I was like, where are the hearings? Where's the exposés? Where's everything else? Because as Julia pointed out in the case of TransDime, that worked, the naming and shaming. There was a hearing, there was a lot of attention, there was a spotlight, there was sunlight, as we like to point out, is just the best disinfectant for these things. So yeah, I'm still disappointed that we don't have more hearings, but maybe, it's not just the financial pain that some people need to feel. Maybe it's being, hauled up to Congress and having some unfortunate viral moments. But to these two questions, and then we will let you go. The first question is for Gordon. Tony Capaccio of Bloomberg here, who, as Julia noted, does pay attention to this. One of the disturbing trends in disclosure is that DoD IG labels many of his reports controlled unclassified information, or CUI. That blocks out specific price parts examples. Did you encounter that a lot? It was once called for official use only.
Sometimes, yes, I did encounter that. It was not a huge thing, but I did encounter that. And I think I always question things that are not being put out to the public, because truthfully, most of it is not going to hurt our country's security. Now, the very top secret things would, but a lot of things fall into that confidential, the lowest level. And I think that's a disservice to solving this problem. And there's only two ways, and I'll be brief, to solve this problem big time. And one you mentioned, you have to have whistleblowers. Without the whistleblowers, you're hurting big time. But there's a lot of potential whistleblowers that are very afraid to come forward. It takes so much courage to do that. And then the other thing, there's no paying to the price gougers unless they get a big, it's all, for the price gouger, the big companies, it comes down to how much pain they can suffer to have to pay these huge fines, or maybe even be put on the sidelines for 6 months. But those are the two things that have to happen. And so that would be, that's my thinking on it. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have one other last question from Graham. Can you speak to price gouging on larger capital acquisitions, including shipbuilding and aircraft? Would your proposed solutions help with those issues as well? This is another pertinent question, because so far we've talked about spare parts and missiles mostly.
Yeah. Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, this is an important question. The contracting infrastructure is a little bit different because often large aircraft and ships are multi-year contracts, meaning that they are giving a lot more upfront to the contractor. They are giving them progress payments to cover their incurred costs over the course of that particular program. So it does operate a little bit differently, like, in the case of our like nuclear triad, you know, we've seen Nunn-McCurdy breaches, so they are subject to sort of different contracting regulations, but it all is in the same bucket. I would just say that, like, you know, those contracts are not going to be subject to TINA's certified cost and pricing information requirements because they're huge. So yeah, they're over that, and they might also be, you know, there might only be one bidder, one offer on that particular contract. So it gets a little bit complicated, but overall, yes, but there's just like a lot of other stuff going on.
Gordon, would you like the last word?
Well, I think the thing to say is that panels like this are very important, and they're needed to keep attention, keep the focus on the problem, because the average American, they get mad about price gouging, but they don't spend their life thinking about it. And we need people, Americans need to know what's in it for them. What am I going to get out of this if we stop the price gouging? Is it in my best interest to be an active citizen communicator? So I thank you, Nan. I applaud the efforts of you to bring this together today. I think it's really important.
Well, some of us do think about this day in and day out. And actually, you both have brought so much good information to the table that I have many more questions. We're going to have part 2 if we don't see more action in this area. And I want to give a big thank you to our audience for excellent questions. My word. And also to Julia and Gordon for lending us your time and expertise today. Very much appreciated. Fascinating conversation. Though it's clear we still have a lot of work to do in this area. So I'm going to let everyone go so we can get back at it. Thank you again. And we will be keeping an eye on this as it moves forward.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.